When the Nintendo Entertainment System began to really take off in North America, it was loaded with character-driven games that defined the platform. From Mario killing helpless turtles and Goombas, to Metroid blasting all kinds of crazy aliens, and even Popeye trying to impress some skinny chick with a weird name, there was no shortage of faces and personalities to associate with the brand. This happens to be one of the reasons why I feel Nintendo did so well early on, by ingraining these properties into everyday American life through commercials, secondary products, and TV shows. Comparatively, Sega had a long history of great games, but they weren't typically the kinds you associated with big and bold personalities. I mean, who the hell was the guy driving the car in Outrun? Who was the dude flying around in Space Harrier? Or the person or persons flying the jet in Afterburner? What about the poor soul that I crashed and exploded so many times in Hang On? Just what the hell is an Opa Opa? In those early days, even when Sega had an actual guy on the screen, they were often bereft of any real personality other than Ninja or random martial arts guy. Sega would later, of course, go big on branding and giving games notable faces and stories to define their products, but their first push for a mascot to represent the hardware was the venerable Alex Kidd. He first showed up in 1986 and quickly became Sega's face for the Master System platform. In this episode, we will take a look at all the games that starred Alex Kidd and answer the question, were these games anywhere near as good as they needed to be to compete with the likes of the Nintendo juggernaut? The first game in the series to hit was 1986 Alex Kidd in Miracle World. Growing up, I was all about Super Mario Bros., and playing Alex Kidd was a major shock to the system. You couldn't jump on enemies, you broke blocks with your fist instead of your head, and there wasn't a fire flower in sight. Instead, I was pounded with a steep difficulty that was made worse by a freaking rock, paper, scissors mechanic that could send you back to redo stages over again. I enjoyed the catchy tunes and the variety in stages, but I felt it simply wasn't on Mario's level in the slightest in the gameplay department. Years later, I played it enough to gain some appreciation for its rather unique design elements. You have the ability to buy power-ups, there are multiple vehicles you can use, and there are horizontal and vertically scrolling levels. It never attained Mario's level of fun factor for me, but for those of you that grew up with it, I learned to understand how and why you held it so dear. Also in 1986, Sega released an arcade game called Alex Kidd: The Lost Stars. While the Master System was establishing the Alex Kidd brand for the home, this was meant to make him recognizable in Sega's coin-op ventures. This is a much more traditional platformer that I'm sad to say lacks much of the appeal and variety of the Sega Master System Miracle World. Gone are the shops, bikes, and boats, replaced by simple power-ups that only last a few seconds. The constant and never-ending onslaught of enemies grows tiresome after a few stages, and there are no real design elements to pick up the slack. The later stages are just closely knit enemies flooding the screen, leaving only perfect timing giving you any real chance to survive. The visuals aren't bad for a game of this era, and it does have two-player co-op, but I found very little to enjoy in this one. Coming off of Miracle World on the Sega Master System, Sega decided to release Alex Kidd BMX Trial in 1987 in Japan only. This was for the Sega Paddle Controller, which was a turn knob analog device released in Japan for only a handful of games. BMX Trial here plays a bit like Enduro Racer, but requires the paddle controller for proper gameplay. You can muddle your way through with a PC using emulation, but it's tough, and the difficulty is already high to begin with. Alex Kidd rides his bike and tries to avoid obstacles and other racers to get to the end in one piece. There's a pretty good reason Sega left this in Japan, and most of it had little to do with the peripheral needed to play it. In 1988, Sega ported Alex Kidd The Lost Stars to the Master System. Unfortunately, despite some nice detailed and colorful visuals, it suffers many of the same shortcomings as the arcade version. It's more of a straight platformer without most of the variety of the original game. But that isn't even the worst of it. This game is also ludicrously difficult. I mean the kind of difficulty that is born of cheap deaths and a stage design that simply isn't fun. And it starts from the moment you take control. The very first stage will likely see most people die dozens of times before defeating it, and most will just plain quit after trying stage 2, a timer 50. Sega really had an issue with making some of these games a balanced experience. A game should never completely annihilate its target audience from the moment they press the start button. Even the software universally accepted as difficult, like Ninja Gaiden on the NES, took a few stages before it ramped up. That leaves this boring and overbearing excuse for a platformer on the bottom rung of Sega Master System titles. In 1989, Alex Kidd made his only appearance on the Sega Genesis, Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle. My god, did I hate this game as a teenager. Early in the life of the Genesis, games were quite sparse for a while, so I was drawn to this as something to play. I guess somebody at Sega loved those rock, paper, scissor matches because they make a return and are as frustrating as ever. But what really hurt this game was that this wasn't 1986 anymore, and the genre had excellent representation. As an action game, it's slow and uninteresting, and as a platformer, it lacks any real hook beyond the floaty, ultra-simple mechanics that just don't play all that well. It's also not a very good-looking game, and most of the assets you see in the first stage are repeated throughout the rest of the game. I mean, even that early in the life of the Genesis, you still had games like Ghouls and Ghosts and Altered Beast, two titles that play infinitely better than this and are considerably better looking and sounding, and frankly, much truer 16-bit experiences than this lame excuse for a game. I'm not really sure what Sega was thinking releasing this in the face of much better looking and playing games already on competing platforms like the TurboGrafx-16. By the time titles like Golden Axe and Revenge of Shinobi landed, this was forgotten completely. In a strange twist for the series, Sega took the 1987 release of Anmitsu Hime for the Japanese Mark III, renamed it Alex Kidd in HiTech World, changed the story and names of the characters, modified the visuals, and released it in the US and Europe in 1989. Since this was originally not an Alex Kidd title, it's radically different from the games before it. Much of what is here is actually an adventure game where you need to explore and have conversations. There's even some trivia you need to engage in. Alex Kidd is trying to find all the pieces to a map that will show him the way to the new arcade in town, and you have a time limit to do it. The story here contradicts the previous games in a number of places, a side effect of the IP being shoehorned into an already made game. Anmitsu Hime had been based on the anime of the same name and had you searching for a cake shop in town instead of an arcade. Once you find what you need to move outside the castle, you'll face ninjas hell-bent on making sure you never reach that arcade. The core gameplay here isn't terrible, but it's so radically different from before, you have to wonder why Sega chose Alex Kidd for such an old game. It's visually simple, and though it's short once you know where everything is located, it's still quite difficult. I have no doubt it has its fans, but if you're looking for more of what you loved about Miracle World, this will likely leave you well disappointed. The final game in the Alex Kidd series was released in 1990 for the Master System. Sega went in a totally new direction here and paired Alex Kidd with many elements of the Shinobi series. The result was nothing short of one of the finest games in the entire library. Alex Kidd attacks with a sword here, can climb ropes and wall jump, and even has access to magic attacks. You get stages and bosses similar in design to Shinobi as well, but there are loads of original assets that hold this experience together. The visuals are nothing short of impressive for the aging Master System. They are colorful, well detailed, and even the music is really good. The story is centered on rescuing your girlfriend from the vile clutches of an evil ninja. The only real complaint I have about this excellent title is that it's just too short. I love the gameplay so much I wanted more, and its 4 stages are over just way too quickly. This is also the only game in the entire series to never be released for the Japanese Mark III. Alas, with the platform tanking in North America and Japan, and the appearance of Sonic the following year, Sega would retire Alex Kidd for good after this release. I'd also like to take a moment to show you just how much Master System box art sucked in the West. In Japan, the Sega Mark III has gorgeous full-color boxes that were often a collage of characters and places from the games. If you take a look at Alex Kidd and Miracle World, the differences are stark. One is colorful and full of personality, while the other is minimalist and downright lacking. It's the same way with the Lost Stars as well. Again, one full of color and things you encounter, the other very sparse and lacking the same level of flair. The closest the West came to getting decent box art was actually in Shinobi World, where Sega finally gave us a bit more color and style. Also, for those of you that really enjoy Miracle World, there is a DX version in the works by Merge Games that adds a new graphics engine, new content, new music, and is releasing in 2021 on multiple platforms. It appears to include the original game as well. I really hope it succeeds because I'd love to see the same treatment for my personal favorite in the series, Shinobi World. As you all know, Sonic burst onto the scene in the summer of 1991, changing Sega's image across all their platforms. There was Sonic for the Genesis, Sonic for the Master System, Sonic for the Game Gear, and eventually, Sonic for the Sega CD. Sega wanted a mascot with speed and attitude that sat in direct contrast to Nintendo's Mario. Whereas many people in North America saw Alex Kidd as a simple knockoff of Nintendo's mustachioed plumber, Sonic was something else entirely. Sega would not revisit the Alex Kidd universe again after Shinobi World. Sonic had taken the reins away and Sega wasn't looking back. While I know some of the Alex Kidd games were well received in some regions, I believe the overall quality of a number of these games were simply lacking for it to have been a mainstream success. While Miracle and Shinobi World had much to offer, pretty much everything in between was the type of stuff you'd have trouble picking up out of the discount bin. Sonic looked better, sounded better, played faster, and had a much more balanced difficulty, and that was far more appealing to the masses. Even though a couple of the Alex Kidd games were fun and well designed, Sega made a good switch here, and one that really enriched their fortunes with every platform they had. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.